You see my title, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, Health, Sanity. I speak about the insanity a little bit later. But speaking about insanity right now, Rainer Sauerborn. This does not mean, no. I was told that while I was outside to talk to the technicians here, you asked me to confirm something, actually. You may have forgotten about that. But actually, I confirm everything you said. That was a joke. Sorry, it fell flat for you. Laugh, please. Okay, anyway, let's go on. Health, sanity, and insanity. The second remark I would like to make is we have a strange choreography here, but it's interesting in a way because we had the symposium first, then afterwards the keynote lectures, and here we started with the effects, and now I talk about the causes, but maybe this has a more impact or a better impact on your memory than if we do it the other way. So let's talk physics now, actually, because you think maybe that you know everything about the physics of climate change, but please listen, maybe something comes up you haven't seen before. And actually, climate science is making tremendous progress over the last 20 years. I think that was a scientific revolution, really, understanding the Earth system, understanding the interactions and so on. And I'll show you a little bit of that right now, if it works. But first, let me refer to the Ebola symposium. Some of you have been here early in the morning. I don't know whether it was mentioned yesterday or so on, but an interesting connection clearly is I've been to West Africa and Central Africa before many times, and interesting thing is that the current outbreak may have to do with the burning, the cutting of the tropical forest in Western and Central Africa, because the host animals of Ebola are clearly the fruit bats. And if you go to such a cave, for example, it's quite interesting. And okay, now these forests are cleared at an amazing rate right now, but also there's sort of mining within the back drops of those countries, and so workers go in and go back. So it's a change of socioeconomic behavior you have. And all these things have to be factored in, apart from the obvious thing that you have global traveling. So endemics can be turned into pandemics these days, but the environmental factor should not be ruled out completely. So I hope there will be more research on that. But this was a short shot, so to speak, and let's take a long shot now. Now, for most of you sitting on the right-hand side, seen from me, and in the back, you are probably not able to really see the details on the screen, but I was told we have only this one here. But nevertheless, what I'm showing, so I'll tell you, this is the global temperature curve over the last 100,000 years. And we really have to put everything in perspective, what we are doing right now. So we can reconstruct the global mean temperature over the last 100,000 years. And you see 100 on the left-hand side means this is 100,000 years before, so during the last big glacial. And the Earth was doing this, more or less, during that course. You see tremendous fluctuations, 10 degrees centigrade within decades, actually. And only 11,000 years ago, we entered what we call the Holocene. This was, in a sense, climate paradise, and it was the only background in which the Neolithic revolution, agriculture settling down and so on, could have happened. This was a short window of opportunity for humanity. Homo sapiens was around for maybe 200,000 years, but developing a civilization was only possible due to this enormous stability of the climate. Now we are about to change that. And we do it, and it all started in Lancashire in northwestern England through the Industrial Revolution, which is not over yet. still going on. It's becoming global right now, and that's what I'm going to show you. This is, when people talk about history, it's always battles and kings and dragons and what have you. But the true story of humanity, in particular of the modern age, in my view, is the sea story of human civilization. Not history, but sea story. I apologize for this pun to the British. But it is an amazing story, and some of you may have seen this, but this is animation. It shows you since 1750 how the emissions from each pixel of land on the globe were increasing, where it all started, how it spread out, and what happened over the last decades, actually. And this is a logarithmic scale. If you look down, so you have blue color, but is almost nothing really, coming from 100 per 100 kilometer pixel. But if it turns red or even purple, then it means 1 billion tons of CO2 coming from a pixel. This is cumulative emission. So it's added up since 1751. And as we go, and as you see it, you can see actually how with cumulative emissions, the carbon sort of depth of geographic regions increase. So I start with now, if it works, of course, and it does work. So everything colored on this map is in Britain so far. For those who would sit very near to the screen, you would even see London as a tiny little blip here. And now watch out on Europe, on all the other continents, nothing happens. Although the French Revolution is already in the making, 1789. So nothing to be seen in France. So abolishing the aristocracy didn't change, but you see something happening on the continent. And that's Germany, actually. And here already the eternal sort of competition between the British and the Germans were established. It's true. When you see other countries, it's really interesting because that's the real story. This is not a movie made in Hollywood. These are the real data. So you see in Central Europe, and you see across the Atlantic something happening. But do you see anything in Africa, in Eastern Asia, in Australia, in Latin America? Nothing. But now we are approaching, 1848. The Communist Manifesto was published. And you see now Germany catching up. Now this was the year 1861 when Bismarck came in charge. And Germany is now becoming the second biggest carbon power in the world. That means became the most industrialized country in the world, lots of science and technology. And this is actually building up this competition that leads to the First World War. Because in the end, you had a showdown between the two carbon powers and their empires, of course. Now we are moving towards the eve of the First World War. And you see there's a third carbon power developing in the United States, and they actually decided the First World War. Now, the industrialization of Germany doesn't end, though, after the First World War. It even accelerates. And when Hitler comes into power, it goes up straight, really, and we are now moving into the Second World War. Now you've seen, if you look to Japan, that other countries are sort of developing emissions and industry. The Second World War is over. There's a slight deceleration during those days. And then in 1960, something starts to happen, which we call the Great Acceleration, or also globalization. Now this industrial revolution and the fossil fuel-based capitalism, if you would like to call it, which was also adopted by the Soviet Union, by the way, is now spreading all over the globe. Now the wall comes down in 1989, and this is the start of the full explosion of the fossil fuel-powered industrialization of the globe. And now you see that China is catching up within 1 decade only. You see, these are cumulative emissions. So the story ends here in 2009. I could extend it, But what you see is that since the 1960s, the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution really went global in the true sense. And now it's sort of invading the most distant spots of the planet, in Cambodia and so on. It's not over yet. We are still during the Industrial Revolution, but at a global scale. And some countries like China have caught up with old Europe within just 2 decades. So Red China has turned into Red China on this map. So that's where we are. Now the question is, of course, when people talk about development and so on, and you have seen this report we did for the World Bank, 4 degrees, turn down the heat. The classic view is that, well, all these other populations in the world have to catch up with old Europe and the United States. And once we have caught up, then we can think about the luxury of environmental protection. No? This would mean that this map would turn completely red. Completely red first. But there are some side effects here, clearly, and we'll talk about it. Global industrialization has a side effect by building very poor factories in Bangladesh, for example. Sometimes they collapse in order to produce T-shirts for the West at the price of $2. You see the Manchester factories on the other side. They are much better built, actually, than those being built right now in Bangladesh or Cambodia. This has been mentioned many times. The ballpark number by the WHO is that about 7 million premature deaths per year through air pollution. That's what the Chinese just learned the hard way. If you go to Beijing right now, you see the pictures, as you can see in the lower panel here. And this actually made the Chinese government change their attitude towards not only air pollution but towards climate change, because if you are in Beijing, you see it directly, while CO2, of course, cannot be felt or smelled or in any way seen, but air pollution is the evil companion of CO2. And that's what you can actually witness. Now, let me talk about where we are going. This is the variation of global mean temperature over the last 10,000 years, 11,000 years, during the Holocene. And you see on the vertical axis, these are just tenths of a degree. So this is not 10 degrees anymore, fluctuations, it's just tenths of a degree. And you see more or less this was a slight warming in the middle of the Holocene, and then a slight going down, which is sometimes erroneously called the Little Ice Age, which only happened in certain regions of the world. It was not a global phenomenon, not at all. And when you see this spike at the end, and there are still people who say, well, this is a natural fluctuation. This is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. But we are not ended yet, and I show you now what will happen under various scenarios, as the IPCC has done. And this is a picture not even published. The paper has been submitted to Nature. But take a minute to understand it, if you can see it at all, but I will explain that to you. I called it the anthropogenic rush through the cryophase space. That means through the glaciation space on Earth, because our climate is really made by the distribution of ice masses. So we have still Greenland glaciated, West Antarctica, East Antarctica, and so on. We have a few glaciers in the mountainous regions. But you see where we come from. 20,000 years ago, global mean temperature was 5 degrees less, actually. When the black line shows you how we have emerged from the Ice Age. And when you see now the big bifurcation, the choices we have. And the choices are according to the injection of carbon into the atmosphere, 1,000 gigatons, 2,000, 3,000. With a state-of-the-art model, we can project this. And you see on the right-hand side for the specialists, the so-called RCP scenarios run by the IPCC. Now, guess what is business as usual? Does anybody have a clue? Rainer, you know it. It's 8.5. Thank you, doctor. Uh, this is the business as usual, actually. It's an injection of about 7,500 gigatons of carbon. You have to multiply it by a factor of 3.6 if you want to convert it in CO2. It's a tremendous amount, but that is precisely the road we are going down right now. And you can see we have put it in perspective because we emerged from the glacial, then many parts of the planet were glaciated. The Holocene was 11,000 years of extreme stability, is called an interglacial. We are entering, even with a warming of 3 degrees, what you might call a hemi-deglacial, where the Greenland ice sheet will melt down, for sure. But actually we are on the road towards the global deglacial, which is the upper one. So from the coolest point we go to the hottest point possible within centuries. And this is the backdrop, I guess, for everything. We talk about Ebola and we talk about SARS and all these things and improving health. But this would simply change our planetary environment for good, or rather said, for bad, and forever, at least for all practical purposes of humankind. So this phase diagram is not an alarmist chart by advocates for action. This is the mainstream average evidence provided by the scientific community. So this is the crash scenario, but it's a crash scenario for 10 billion people. And let me slightly sort of qualify what has been said before. I fully agree with co-benefits and no regrets and everything. But you know, I don't think we can solve the climate crisis, as Jonathan Putt said, just by looking for opportunities and co-benefits. We will be fine if we just do the right thing. No, this is an existential question, so to speak. It's a question like, if you have certain evidence that your child may have developed a certain type of cancer, would you just forget about it, or would you go to the best possible hospital? And if the evidence is 90%, and we talk about 90 or 95% evidences here, would you just go home and say, it will be fine? It's impossible to think even. But we do think in this way when it comes to the planet. This, of course, has to do that Homo sapiens is not an intelligent species. I mean, we have developed a central nervous system and good manual abilities and so on. But we're absolutely unable to think in longer terms. And that is true for smoking and cancer, and I can go on forever, really. That's why we need policymakers, by the way, because we hand over our responsibilities at the voting boxes and expect those people to think in longer terms than we do as an ordinary citizen. That's the responsibility of policymakers. We have to work against the normal attitudes of Homo sapiens. So it's very good to have this conference here. So I talked too long about this, but you can see this type of science is really getting to you if you do it for too long, and I've done it now for 30 years. There is another thing which I wanted to share with you, which may not be so well known, because it always goes down the drain when you talk about global warming and floods and so on. Why do we have so many more extreme events? And as a physicist, I first look at the basic wave equations, which can be written down, precise equations, and we have supercomputers, and you do some hypotheses, and then you try to test it. And what we find is that global warming is not a gradual phenomenon. Of course, we can look at 2 degrees warming, how will the heat stress develop, and so on. And of course, we know, Clausius Clapeyron, that hot air will hold more water vapor, which comes down occasionally again, so you have floods. But the really interesting things are the non-linearities in the Earth system. And this is the chart I introduced in the year 2000, actually, at the lecture I gave at Oxford University about the so-called tipping points in the Earth system. These are tipping elements. These are, in medical terms, the vital organs of our planetary body. And some of these vital organs can simply be pushed into a different mode of operation or even be killed, like the Amazon rainforest, the Great Barrier Reef, but also the monsoon system can be stabilized, El Nino suffer an oscillation, and the big ice sheet. But what transpired only a few years ago is that one really important organizing element in the Earth system for extreme events and for our daily weather, actually, is the jet stream. There is a high-speed wind ribbon 12 kilometers above our heads, which is encircling the planet from west to east. If you do a transatlantic flight, you feel it because you gain more or less 1 or 1.5 hours if you go eastwards, and you have to work against the jet stream when you go west. And this jet stream is, as I said, a ribbon. And I will tell you a little bit more about it, and actually, in order to save time, because maybe the moderator is becoming already nervous. If not, tell me. Oh, he's very nervous, I learned. So I will directly go to these extreme events. I will not talk about, you see here, the ice sheet and so on. The only bad news is that the West Antarctic ice sheet, or at least parts of it, have already tipped into irreversible decline. And you can, simply because the grounding line of the ice shelf has retreated into land, and now there's only one way to go for the ice mass, is just downslide. This has happened already. The tipping point has been transgressed already. This was not the title story or the cover story of the New York Times. This was an extremely important event. This year, actually, nobody takes care of it.